Sweden, a country that for decades was a symbol of stability, social justice and openness, but today, this same country faces one of the biggest crises in its history: mass immigration. How did Sweden get here? What is it doing to solve this complex problem? And what implications does this situation have for the country's future? What you will discover throughout this video will surprise you. I assure you, the best is yet to come. So if you think you know the story, stay tuned because the ending is something you wouldn't expect. For decades, Sweden has been a beacon of hope for thousands of people fleeing war and persecution. From the Balkan Wars in the 1990s to the recent conflicts in Syria and Afghanistan, Sweden has opened its doors to those seeking a new beginning. Sweden's reputation as a safe and prosperous place was consolidated over time. But what happens when that flow of people begins to overwhelm a country's capacities? In 2015, the migration crisis reached its peak. Sweden, a country with barely 10 million inhabitants, received more than 160,000 asylum applications in a single year. This made it the country with the highest rate of asylum seekers per capita in Europe. To understand the magnitude of this phenomenon, imagine that a small country like Finland received more than 500,000 refugees in a single year. The capacity of the Swedish system began to show cracks. The historical context is important. Since the late 20th century, Sweden had adopted a humanitarian immigration policy, accepting refugees not only for economic reasons but also due to a deep commitment to human rights. In previous decades, it welcomed refugees from conflicts such as those in Chile, Iran, Somalia, and the Balkans. This tradition of humanitarian openness, backed by a strong economy and a solid welfare state, was key to the country's international image. As immigration increased, so did the challenges. The Swedish welfare system, one of the most advanced in the world, came under extreme pressure. Resources allocated to education, health, and social assistance began to dwindle. One of the main challenges was labour integration. Although Sweden has been a country with low unemployment rates, the integration of newcomers into the labour market was not as swift as expected. The historical context is important. Since the late 20th century, Sweden had adopted a humanitarian immigration policy, accepting refugees not only for economic reasons but also due to a deep commitment to human rights. In previous decades, it welcomed refugees from conflicts such as those in Chile, Iran, Somalia, and the Balkans. This tradition of humanitarian openness, backed by a strong economy and a solid welfare state, was key to the country's international image. As immigration increased, so did the challenges. The Swedish welfare system, one of the most advanced in the world, came under extreme pressure. Resources allocated to education, health, and social assistance began to dwindle. One of the main challenges was labour integration. Although Sweden has been a country with low unemployment rates, the integration of newcomers into the labour market was not as swift as expected. According to a report from the Central Bank of Sweden, between 2015 and 2018, only 30% of the asylum seekers who arrived in 2015 managed to find employment in their first 3 years in the country. This not only economically impacted the newcomers, but also created tensions among native Swedes, especially in areas where unemployment was already high. Public perception began to change. In the suburbs of Stockholm, Malmö, and Gothenburg, crime and violence rates began to rise, which caused concern among citizens. Far-right politicians did not take long to capitalize on this frustration, using immigration as a scapegoat for all the problems the country was facing. But is it fair to blame immigration for all these problems? This is where the narrative becomes more complex. While it's true that mass immigration created significant challenges, the reality is that many of Sweden's economic and social problems already existed before the migration crisis. The lack of affordable housing, problems in the educational system, and long waiting lists in the health system are issues that Sweden had been facing for years. Mass immigration simply accelerated the need to find solutions. One of the most sensitive aspects of the migration crisis in Sweden has been the issue of national identity. Sweden, like many Nordic countries, has had a very homogeneous cultural identity for much of its history. The massive arrival of people from different cultures, religions, and ethnicities generated tensions in some communities. In cities like Malmö, where the population of immigrant origin exceeded 50%, questions began to arise about what it means to be Swedish in the 21st century. The policy of multiculturalism that Sweden adopted in previous decades began to be questioned. Some sectors of society argued that the country should adopt a more assimilationist approach, where immigrants should adapt to Swedish values and customs. Others defended that cultural diversity is a wealth that must be protected. This debate over Swedish identity not only affected internal politics, but also Sweden's image abroad. According to the Swedish Institute of Statistics, in 2023, 25% of the Swedish population had some type of migratory background. This undoubtedly changed the country's cultural landscape, from gastronomy to traditions. However, the tensions were not solely due to diversity, but also to the perception that resources were being used disproportionately to serve immigrants, while native citizens felt that their needs were not being met. With all this context, the Swedish government knew it could not continue with the same approach. In 2016, Sweden implemented a series of migration reforms that marked a before and after. The most significant change was the tightening of asylum policies. From that moment on, permanent residence permits were limited and temporary permits were introduced. This meant that applicants had to meet certain requirements, such as finding employment and learning the language, to be able to renew their legal status. The government also began to work closely with the European Union to improve control of external borders. Sweden, as a member of the Schengen area, did not have internal borders with other European countries, which facilitated the movement of people within the EU. However, controls were strengthened at the country's entry points, and programs were implemented to facilitate the voluntary return of those immigrants whose asylum applications were rejected. These policies were accompanied by a renewed focus on integration. The government allocated more resources to educational programs and job training for immigrants. This not only helped reduce unemployment among immigrants, but also fostered social cohesion. Between 2018 and 2022, the employment rate among immigrants increased by 20%, which represented a significant improvement, according to a report by the Swedish Immigration Council. This positive trend not only relieved pressure on the welfare system, but also helped to invigorate key sectors of the economy. What Sweden is achieving is not just an internal victory, but a model that other European countries are closely watching. Border control policies combined with the promotion of integration have begun to yield tangible results. Crime levels have decreased in some of the areas that were previously considered hotspots of social conflict. Cities like Stockholm and Gothenburg are seeing a revitalization in sectors where unemployment and social exclusion previously predominated. Additionally, the Swedish government has worked on reforming the housing system. Investment in the construction of affordable housing has increased, and policies are being implemented to prevent the segregation of communities. Access to housing remains a challenge, but urbanization policies are beginning to balance the situation. But what's next for Sweden? Is this the definitive solution? Although the country has made significant progress, the issue of immigration will continue to be one of the most relevant debates in Swedish politics. The key question is whether Sweden will be able to maintain this balance between migration control and social inclusion, or if tensions will resurface. Sweden has shown that even in the most difficult times, it is possible to find balanced solutions. The combination of restrictive policies and integration programs has allowed the country to regain control of its immigration system without sacrificing its humanitarian values. However, it is crucial to understand that this process has not been easy. There have been mistakes and setbacks along the way. Political polarization remains a challenge, and populist parties continue to use the issue of immigration to gain followers. But what is clear is that Sweden has shown that a balanced approach between border control and integration is possible. Sweden has managed, despite difficulties, to move towards an effective and long-term solution regarding the migration crisis. Cultural and social tensions are still present, but progress is tangible, which has allowed the country to maintain its economic and social stability without giving up its humanitarian commitment. Sweden's future is yet to be written, but what is clear is that the lessons learned in this process can be applied in other countries facing similar challenges. The advances in Sweden offer a roadmap for other European countries, many of which are facing their own immigration crises. We have seen how Sweden, a country that seemed to be on the verge of collapse due to mass immigration, has found a way to manage this challenge. It has been difficult years, but the reforms and policies implemented are bearing fruit. Sweden is showing the world that it is possible to balance security, integration, and respect for human rights. But this is not the only nation facing a similar challenge. Italy, for example, is struggling with its own migration crisis and is adopting a completely different approach. In our next video, we will explore how Italy is dealing with immigration and what lessons other countries can learn from its experience. If you have found this video interesting, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss more content on the big topics that are defining the world we live in. See you in the next video.